Adebayo Akinwell was 30 years old when he stood at the podium and said something that made the entire world stop listening to what he was saying about his business empire, and start listening to what he was saying about his life. "Everything I am," he said, his voice steady, his eyes finding hers in the crowd, "I owe to a woman the world considers a maid. She raised me. She loved me. She sacrificed for me. And today, I'm asking the world to know her name." He pulled up her photograph on the screen behind him. A woman in her 60s, her face worn by decades of work, her eyes kind. The woman who had cleaned his father's house. The woman who had wiped his nose when he cried. The woman his biological mother had treated like she was invisible. Her name is Amina. And today, I'm announcing that I've transferred the majority of my wealth to a trust in her name. She will never work again. She will be cared for the rest of her life. Because the only person in my entire childhood who actually saw me was her. The room erupted. Cameras flashed. People shouted questions. But Adebayo wasn't looking at them. He was looking at Amina, tears streaming down her face, her hand covering her mouth, unable to believe what she was hearing. But nobody in that room knew the full story. Nobody understood what those 30 years had cost Amina. Nobody understood that she had been the mother to a billionaire while the world treated her like she was nobody. Nobody understood that this moment, this public acknowledgement, was justice so long overdue that it had almost never come at all. Amina was born in Ibadan in 1960. Her family was poor. Not struggling poor, but the kind of poor where you don't know if you'll eat the next day. Her mother died when she was 7. Her father couldn't care for her alone. At 12, she was sent to work as a housemaid for a wealthy family in Lagos. She learned to cook. She learned to clean. She learned to be invisible in a house full of people. She learned that her value was in her usefulness. And she learned to be content with very little. In 1980, at the age of 20, she was working for the Akinwell family. They were wealthy, old money, political connections, enormous colonial-era house with staff. Mr. Akinwell was a businessman. Mrs. Akinwell was a socialite. They had a son, Adebayo. He was 3 years old. And he was the loneliest child Amina had ever seen. His mother was always out. Parties, events, visiting friends. His father was always working. The nannies came and went, they had no real attachment to him. Adebayo would cry and no one would come. He would wander the enormous house looking for someone to notice him. And Amina, cleaning the floors, would notice. Bayo, she started calling him, giving him a nickname only she used. "Come. Help me sweep." He was 3. He couldn't really help. But he could be near someone. Someone who was paying attention. Someone who cared if he existed. She would wake him up in the mornings. She would make sure he ate. She would braid his hair, poorly at first, because she was learning as she went. She would teach him words in Yoruba and English. She would hold him when he had nightmares. She would be there. Mrs. Akinwell noticed, eventually. And she wasn't pleased. She complained to Mr. Akinwell, "The maid is getting too attached to the boy. It's inappropriate. She's filling his head with nonsense." But Mr. Akinwell barely heard her. He was too busy building his empire. "She's just helping," he said dismissively. "Let her be." So Amina continued. Years passed. Adebayo grew. And in his growing, he became her entire world. Not out of obligation. Out of love. He was the child she would never have. The family she would never have. The person who loved her back when the rest of the world treated her like she was nothing. She didn't know that she was building the future. She didn't know that the boy she was raising would one day be rich beyond measure, and that her investment in him, not with money, but with time, attention, and love, would be the most valuable investment she could ever make. She just knew that for the first time in her life, someone needed her. Really needed her. Not for what she could do, but for who she was. By the time Adebayo was 10, Amina was 30. She was still a maid. She still slept in the servants' quarters. She still earned barely enough to survive. She still had no life outside of caring for this family. But she was essential. When Adebayo started school and came home crying because the other children made fun of him, Amina was there. She held him. She told him he was smart. She told him he was worthy. She told him his mother's distance wasn't his fault. When he was bullied, she defended him. When he was sick, she nursed him. When he was struggling with lessons, she studied alongside him, learning so she could help him understand. She was the first person he saw in the morning and the last person he saw before bed. She was the only consistency in his life. Mrs. Ekinwe resented this. She resented that her son was more attached to a maid than to her. She would punish Amina by separating them, sending her on errands, assigning her extra work, making sure she wasn't available when Adebayo needed her. But Amina would find ways. She would wake up earlier, stay up later, work faster, just to have a few moments with the boy. When Adebayo was 14, his mother tried to fire her. The boy is too attached to her, she told her husband. It's time she left. I want to hire a professional nanny. Someone appropriate. But Adebayo refused. For the first time in his life, he stood up to his mother. If Amina leaves, I leave, he said. He was 14 years old and he was willing to lose his home for her. Something in his mother, perhaps shame, perhaps just the shock that her son would choose a maid over her, made her stop. She didn't push it further. Amina stayed. Through secondary school, through university, Amina was there. She didn't go to his graduation, the family made sure to keep her in the background. She worked while he studied. She sacrificed while he achieved. She was his foundation, but the world was never supposed to know it. By the time Adebayo was 30, he had built a business empire. He was wealthy beyond anything his father had achieved. He was powerful, respected, known. And nobody in that world knew that the woman who had made him who he was had spent 47 years as a servant in his family's house. Amina had given her entire adult life, 45 years of service, sacrifice, and invisible love. And in the eyes of the world, she was still just the maid. Her contribution was so profound and so completely unacknowledged that it was almost as if it never happened. Mrs. Ekinwe was not evil. That's what made it worse. She wasn't intentionally cruel. She was just absent. She had a son, but she had never really wanted to be a mother. She wanted a family because it was expected. She wanted a perfect life that looked good in photographs. But she didn't want the mess and the complexity of actually loving someone else. So when her son reached for her, she redirected him. When he needed her, she wasn't available. And when a maid stepped in and did what she should have done, Mrs. Ekinwe resented that maid. She resented being shown up. She resented that her son loved someone else more than he loved her. She never acknowledged Amina's contribution. Never thanked her. Never even called her by her name unless absolutely necessary. Amina was the maid. A service provider. Someone who could be replaced at any time. When Adebayo became successful, Mrs. Ekinwe took credit. In interviews, she would talk about how she raised a strong son. How she instilled values. How she made sure he was disciplined. None of it was true. She had done almost nothing except create distance and expectation. And the world believed her because she was the mother. Because she had money and status and a beautiful face. Because nobody questioned whether she was actually the one who had done the work. Meanwhile, Amina remained invisible. She had raised a billionaire and nobody knew. She had invested everything in a human being and received nothing in return except the knowledge that she had done right by him. She had loved when love wasn't her job, and her reward was to be forgotten by everyone except the one person who mattered. The true villain of Amina's story wasn't evil. She was just indifferent. She had the advantage of position and biology but not the capacity for love. And that made her the worst kind of villain, the one who destroys through neglect. At 30, Adebayo had everything. Money, power, respect, recognition. But he was also lonely. He was surrounded by people, business associates, friends, people who wanted something from him. But there was no one who knew him. No one who remembered when he was small and afraid. No one who loved him when he was nobody. His mother showed up to his events. She posed for photographs. She claimed credit for his success. She played the proud mother in public while maintaining cold distance in private. She had never apologized for her absence. She had never acknowledged that Amina had been the one. And Adebayo realized something devastating: his mother had stolen his story. She had taken credit for something she didn't do. She had inserted herself into a narrative that didn't belong to her. She was being celebrated for motherhood while the actual mother of his heart remained a servant in his family home. He started asking himself hard questions. What kind of man would he be if he accepted this lie? What kind of success was it if it was built on the invisible sacrifice of someone the world didn't even see? What did his achievement actually mean if they meant nothing to the woman who had made them possible? He looked at his life and he saw the truth: he had everything except integrity. He had succeeded, but he had done so by allowing the world to forget the person who had made his success possible. He was complicit in her invisibility. And that was the worst kind of betrayal. The danger wasn't that something bad was going to happen to Adebayo. The danger was that he would go through his entire life accepting a false version of his own story. That he would die someday and leave the world believing that his mother had raised him. That Amina would die invisible. And that he would have had the power to change that and chosen not to. At 30 years old, standing at the peak of his success, Adebayo made a decision that would cost him his relationship with his family, alienate him from his mother's circle, and make him an outsider in the world that had celebrated him. But it was the right decision. That moment at the podium was carefully planned. Adebayo had consulted with his team. He had thought about the consequences. He had made peace with what he was about to do. He had also told Amina. The night before, he sat with her in her small room in the servants' quarters, a room she had lived in for 47 years. And he said, "Tomorrow, the world is going to know who you are." She cried. Not from happiness, though there was some of that. But from relief. From finally being seen. From having her sacrifice acknowledged. After decades of being invisible, she was finally going to be visible. The announcement sent shockwaves through Lagos high society. Headlines screamed, "Billionaire gives entire fortune to family maid." Business analysts questioned whether it was a publicity stunt. His mother issued a statement denying everything, claiming Amina had manipulated her son. His friends distanced themselves, worried that his generosity might make them feel obligated to be generous too. But Adebayo didn't care. He had made his choice. And the choice was to finally honor the woman who had honored him every single day of his life. He set up a trust with over 50% of his wealth. Amina would never have to work again. She would be cared for. She would be respected. She would be acknowledged. He hired her personal staff, as a joke, but also as a reversal. The woman who had served his family for decades would now have people serving her. But more than that, he did something else. He told the world the truth. He gave interview after interview about who actually raised him. He talked about Amina's sacrifice. He named her as the reason for his success. He made sure that when people heard about Adebayo Akinwel's empire, they also heard about Amina's role in building it. And slowly, the narrative changed. Amina stopped being the maid. She became the woman who raised Adebayo Akinwel. She became famous. Not as a celebrity, but as a symbol of invisible labor finally being seen. Not as a servant, but as a mother. The moment Adebayo chose to tell the truth was the moment he transformed not just Amina's life, but the entire story of his own. He went from being a self-made billionaire to being something more honest, a man who had been raised by love and was finally acknowledging it. Mrs. Akinwel was humiliated. The woman who had spent decades playing the role of perfect mother was suddenly exposed. She tried to recover, to salvage her reputation, but it was too late. The world had seen the truth. She faded from public life. She died 3 years later, alone and bitter, still unable to accept that her son loved the maid more than he loved her. Adebayo lost some of his wealth, yes. But what he gained was infinitely more valuable. He gained peace. He gained integrity. He gained the knowledge that he had done right by the person who had done right by him. And Amina. Amina's life transformed completely. But not in the way people might expect. She didn't become a billionaire herself, she was part of his wealth trust, but she never became obsessed with money. Instead, she became a mentor. She opened a home for abandoned children. She taught them what she had taught Adebayo, that love is the most valuable thing you can give. She moved out of the servants' quarters. She got a beautiful house, though she still lived simply. She was celebrated at events. But most importantly, she was no longer invisible. When people looked at her, they saw, this is the woman who raised Adebayo Akinwell. And they saw respect. The consequences weren't punishment. They were truth. Mrs. Akinwell faced the consequence of living a life for so long that nobody believed her anymore. Adebayo faced the consequence of losing wealth but gaining something priceless. And Amina faced the consequence of being finally visible. This is what justice looks like, not revenge, but the truth being acknowledged. Not the powerful being destroyed, but their lies being exposed. Not the invisible becoming famous, but being finally seen for who they always were. If you're watching this and you recognize yourself in Amina, if you've spent your life caring for people who didn't acknowledge it, if you've been invisible while doing important work, if you've been taken for granted by the people you sacrifice for, I want you to know something. Your sacrifice matters. Your work matters. Your love matters. Even if nobody sees it right now. Even if the people you're caring for don't understand it yet. Even if the world treats you like you're nothing. Because eventually, someone will see. Someone will understand. And they will honor you. Not because you demanded it, but because that's what real love does. Real love comes back. Real love acknowledges. Real love says, I see what you did. I see who you are. I am grateful. And if you recognize yourself in Adebayo, if you're someone who has benefited from invisible sacrifice, if you have people in your life who have loved you without recognition, if you have built your life on the foundation of someone else's work, then I ask you, what are you waiting for? Acknowledge them. See them. Tell the world about them. Because the greatest betrayal isn't cruelty. It's forgetting. It's accepting the lie that you did this alone. It's allowing the person who made you to remain invisible. Amina didn't ask for recognition. She didn't demand it. She simply loved and served with her whole heart, expecting nothing in return. But Adebayo gave her something precious anyway. He told the truth. And in telling the truth, he gave her back her visibility. This is the lesson: the people we should honor are not always the ones society tells us to honor. They're the ones who loved us when loving us was hard. They're the ones who saw us when we were invisible. They're the ones who gave everything and asked for nothing. So look around your life. Who is the Amina? Who is the person whose sacrifice you've accepted without acknowledging? And what are you going to do about it? Because this moment, this awareness, is yours. This is your chance to tell the truth. To see the invisible. To honor the people who honored you. That's the story of Adebayo and Amina. And maybe it's time for your story to begin.